Hello and welcome to the Chess Bit, the podcast where two guys talk about the World Chess Championship. I'm John Mackenzie and I'm joined, as always at the moment, by Robin Sarfas. Robin, how are you?
Can't get rid of me,
Can't
despite your
get rid of you.
protestations on Thursday. I did listen back to your Benji and Dan's podcast. That was nice to hear.
How are you? You okay?
Yeah, doing all right. Sort of, I think much like the players, still recovering from yesterday a little bit. Kind of a bit of fatigue.
Yeah, quite an exhausting game, really, in a lot of ways. It's the first time I've really experienced a game that long where you sort of go and do things and then come back and it's still going, and then go and do something else and then come back and it's still going. So,
to be honest, I was surprised to wake up this morning and find they weren't still actually playing.
Yeah,
the end had been some sort of mirage.
But there was another game today. The players have no rest, so we will talk about Game 7, which ended in a fairly quick draw, as we suspected it might have done yesterday in the stream. But if anyone is watching and they are in the chat on YouTube, do drop us some questions in. I can see we've already got a couple of questions that we will get to shortly. If you're watching on Twitter, then I don't think we can see your questions if you submit them through Periscope. So you'll have to go to YouTube for us to see those questions. So sorry about that, but do get in touch and let us know that you're watching and what you're up to and how you're feeling about the World Chess Championship. But yeah, let's get onto this game. So just a very quick overview. It was Nepomniachtchi with white. He went down the Roy Lopez line that we've seen him go down in every game for white so far, taking anti-martial lines. But today, a little bit more solid, would you say, from Nepo? Made it very clear very early on that he wanted a sort of quiet game, just didn't want to do anything silly so that he wasn't 2 games back.
Yeah, he's gone since game 3. He's been going for this A4 anti-martial as opposed to H3, and then it's been sort of subtle deviations therein ever since. Played D3 instead of C3 at some point, a bit quieter, I think that was I mean, he was, I think playing. I guess he was playing for an advantage at some point, but there was certainly a certain point at which he perhaps could have played slightly more testing moves, but they maybe were slightly more double-edged, and I just don't know if he was really up to it. Both players talked about sort of yesterday being very, very tired. Carlsen had the experience of when you've I've had this when I've played sort of my best games, obviously not quite to the not sort of 8-hour World Championship thrillers, but often you do find at night you're sort of so kind of like the adrenaline is so much that you're just so pumped and it's hard to get your mind off it and get to sleep. So I imagine that Carlsen was still pretty tired as well, and probably both players relieved with the draw. I think that we were talking about it yesterday, and I think I've maybe softened on the idea that it was probably the right thing to do for Nepo this time. I mean, it still remains that he's got to go out and win a game at some point, but yeah, it's hard not to sympathise with the desire just to sort of try and make it to the rest day from here. Be interesting to see what happens tomorrow, I think.
Yeah, I've just watched Levi Rosman's recap of the game, and he focused particularly on this line. I think in the game, Nepo did C takes D4 at one point. When I guess within the middle game, and apparently the pundits were talking about potentially knight taking D4 in that situation, but I think Nepo took pretty quickly. It was almost like a snap take. So does that just suggest that Nepo was like, yeah, let's just get this over and done with, move on to the next few games?
Well, C takes D4 is kind of the classical way of playing in terms of it maintains this nice pawn center with pawns on D and E4. That's kind of what, from a classical standpoint, what you want, right? It gives you very nice central control. It's kind of the point of the C3 move to support the D4 square is such that you can recapture C takes D. So it's very natural to do so, and I imagine that was his plan. Pat, I to be honest, I haven't looked. I haven't watched that particular recap, so I haven't looked into that line there. But it's I don't necessarily know the extent to which Nepo weighed them both up and just elected to play for C takes D because it was quieter, or whether it was just he felt like it was going to be the best move. I haven't seen if there was a sort of if a computer or what would say that the knight taking was actually better or more challenging for white, but yeah, I don't imagine that Nepo was going to be chancing his arm with anything he wasn't sure was 100% fine for him.
I think the idea was just that it would make your pawn structures asymmetrical, and then that just suggests that there's maybe a little bit more in the position than there would have been otherwise. And if you're wanting to just get a sort of bog standard quick draw, then the thing to do is keep your pawn structures as symmetrical as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a asymmetrical pawn structure, right? After, because it was after Magnus takes E takes D, right? So Magnus was missing one of his central pawns, and recapturing C takes D for Nepo. So that was slightly imbalanced, but obviously it could be rebalanced after Magnus's later C5. I think is the point.
Right. Yeah. You've already mentioned what will happen tomorrow. Let's talk about that now, and then we can maybe go back and have a bit more of a chat about Game 6 as well, because we had a few questions in the chat about Game 6. So what do you make of the way that they will go into the game tomorrow? Then is it going to be Nepo again wanting just another quick draw, get it over and done with, and then start thinking about his go with white pieces after the rest day on Monday?
Yeah, I wonder if it will depend on how they feel tomorrow, because no doubt that Nepo's team are already working on sharpening up his lines, right, and stuff. So I imagine there will be prep there ready for, there will have been contingency plans of what is the strategy if we go down in the match and things. So, but from Nepo's perspective, it depends on whether or not he decides he's ready to move to sort of DEFCON 1 and say, okay, we need to really push the boat out here, or if he feels like, no, get the rest day in, get to the next white game 9, and then sort of go from there with the strategy of winning one of the final 6 games, and then the converse perspective is Magnus, right? He may look and think that, okay, he's got Nepo on the ropes a little bit, that Nepo's going to be sort of, if Magnus feels that Nepo might be more tired than him, that maybe he's going to sort of try and sort of close things out now while he's got that window. But at the same time, he might also think, well, the onus is on Nepo to be the one to take risks here, and so Magnus might return to his E4 stuff and say to Nepo, you're going to have to sharpen this up if you want. But that's if Magnus even wants to give Nepo that opportunity, because obviously playing E4, you open yourself up to potential, Sicilian Najdorf, right? But then there's always going to be some sharp way of playing for, if Magnus plays D4, Nepo can go for his Grunfeld. If he plays C4, Nepo can go for a reverse Sicilian. So it's impossible for Magnus to stop Nepo imbalancing the position to that degree. So I think it might be more up to Nepo to decide what kind of game we get. I think if Nepo says that he wants to play solidly and go for the draw tomorrow, then I think Magnus might acquiesce to that.
In which case, will he? Well, I was just going to say, if in that case, would he just go for E4 then and hope that Nepo went with the Petrov again?
Maybe, although I just think Magnus has got better chances from the D4 stuff. I think that there was if Magnus wants the Petrov stuff is going to really, because it's so forcing, is really going to let Nepo off the hook in terms of making him work at all. So maybe Magnus would say he'll play the D4 stuff, but then make it more theoretical and solid, rather than going for something sort of offbeat. It's tough to say. I think we can't answer that without knowing how the players sleep tonight. How they actually just feel tomorrow, if they feel like recovered or not. But I would expect a draw tomorrow.
Well, let's go back and maybe decompress the game yesterday a little bit more.
Yeah.
We've had a few questions in the chat from Spillditch that I think are quite interesting. So the question is, Game 6, is this a trend in Magnus's games, strength in numbers in terms of quantity of pieces rather than value? Magnus sacrificed a queen in this game versus Nishigiri 2021 Meltwater Champions Chess Tour tiebreak Blitz Game 1. That's knowledge that I don't have. I know this is different from a queen for 2 rooks, but it felt similar how Magnus closed off the end game. But yeah, worth talking about that, because I think to a lot of people who don't watch a lot of chess, the idea of giving up your queen for 2 rooks is a queen sacrifice, when I think most professional chess players wouldn't view it as such, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, what is a sacrifice, right? Like the idea, like the word sacrifice typically means that you're giving something up, right? The offering of something up entirely. Whereas clearly in chess, you're always looking to get something back for whatever material you are quote unquote sacrificing. So it doesn't quite translate there. Yeah, I think that you've always got to. I think the better you get at chess, the more nuance you get. Understanding the relative value of the pieces in the context of the position that you're playing, right? The classic argument that comes here is bishop versus knight, right? A bishop is sort of on a kind of objective level. A machine would tell you is typically better than a knight, right? If you could start the game without your bishops or without your knights, and you're going to play an odds match, you would clearly be better off keeping both the bishops. But that then has the that's not to say that in every position it would be correct if you can swap a knight for a bishop, and it's sort of following things like the principle of a bishop is better than a knight, or indeed the sort of general sort of points totals of the pieces that you learn when you're young, right? The more that the further on in chess you get, the more you learn that those are rules that are there to be broken, right? You do see players offer up, exchange sacrifices, offer up, a queen for 2 pieces and some some initiative, things like that. It's and obviously at the highest level, right, there is really an understanding there, and yeah, so Magnus was, I think the key sort of illustrative point of that is when Magnus offered up that rook for the bishop, right, knowing that even though he's giving up the exchange there, he's actually weakening Nepo's position more by him forcing him to play with just the queen rather than the queen and minor piece. His 2 rooks and a minor piece is sort of points wise better than a queen and a bishop, whereas points wise a queen is better than just 1 rook and the knight. But obviously that's not actually how it translates to on the board. So I don't know if it's necessarily just a Magnus thing to say strength in numbers. It's more just he has such a good kind of positional understanding, especially when there are fewer pieces on the board, that he can make evaluations like that. And he is, the queen is not the best kind of defender in that position, right? Is relying on sort of attacking weaknesses in a position, right, with its flexibility of movement. Whereas obviously it's possible for Magnus in the position yesterday to formulate a sort of setup where he doesn't have any weaknesses in his position, right? He's got his pawns protected by his king, his pieces protecting each other or by pawns, etc. Right? He can just and then what is the queen to do but just sort of buzz around and try and get checks in where possible, things like that. But it's sort of hard to stop progress there once you get the right formation.
Yeah, obviously the queen is going to be the most powerful piece in terms of getting checks, but if you only have to worry about one piece doing that, it's fairly easy to block them off. And obviously that's what Magnus did really well with his knight yesterday in getting his knight in the middle of that pawn blockade at one point, just so that the queen couldn't find any easy checks, and then you just sort of roll down the board slowly but surely, right?
Yeah, if you're a sort of lower rated player playing like a blitz game, well, low rated player, or if you're playing at very fast time control, like even faster than yesterday, then clearly a queen is going to have more practical value than 2 rooks because the potential for like forks and things like that. Whereas, but in actuality, there's a reason why by that sort of points metric, 2 rooks adds up to 10 and a queen is given as 9. So it's as you get less into the sort of like practicalities of the queen being sort of high, it's a bit like the knight, right? The knights are, as Jan Gustafsson once famously said, how come grandmasters value the bishop above the knight when the knight is jumpier? Again, if you're in time trouble and you have to calculate loads of forks, right? That's more difficult. But in game terms, it's understandable to say that more pieces is better.
Yeah, no, of course. And that was a question from Spildrich. You also mentioned the way that Magnus was gaining time in between moves 76 and 78 just by repeatedly attacking the bishop with the rook, just gaining some time advantage for him to think about what was going on, right?
Yeah, if you know that you have a forcing continuation, right, then you can just repeat move and your opponent's willing to repeat moves, right? Obviously, you're getting 30 seconds for every move, so if it shows a cool head, right? And that's Magnus played a lot of blitz and bullet in the run up to this tournament, and I'm not saying that specifically serves him well here, but having having those sort of like blitzy, like quick play sort of tricks up your sleeve, stuff like doing everything you can to gain time, stuff like that does serve him well, right? It's like anything, it's practice.
Yeah. Just a question for you. about Game 6. So how do you feel about it the day after? How do you feel looking back now? Because obviously we were still in the throes of having watched it when we talked last night. How are you feeling about it now?
Good question. I have given more thought to Magnus's point that he made straight after the game about maybe showing a bit more patience. Sort of reevaluating, I think, right towards the end, this H pawn push, and swapping his H pawn for Magnus's G pawn, right? So going down to the sort of reduced table base end game that we got, and it does simplify the position. And maybe if he had all the time in the world, that would be a good practical decision to make, because and it's maybe even a tempting thing to do it in time trouble. But obviously, again, we said that the queen is good at attacking, right, and that the G pawn was like one of the few potential weaknesses in Magnus's position. And so maybe keeping that extra point, as we've already said here, that Nepo didn't have, it was very hard for him to sort of catch Magnus off guard, right? Magnus only ever had to worry about queen moves, basically. And so maybe that was a little mistake. I've looked through the game sort of in its entirety now, rather than watching sort of sections of it. So sort of got more of an understanding for the position as a whole. I was Nepo must, I think, feel the disappointment that Nepo must feel, I think, is perhaps bigger than I thought, because obviously he's contributed to this sort of great game and he's played sort of very well at moments for it. But it is he worked extremely hard to then, I guess, take a drawn position and then turn it into a loss, right? And Magnus is so famous for his ability to do that to people, right? To just grind the tiniest of advantages into a win. And so for Nepo to sort of lose a game in that fashion, right, in the manner that everyone would predict that he would maybe lose a game, is maybe disappointing. But I don't know if there's a better way that he could have prepared for those situations, right? Ultimately, all he can do is just go and try and play the right moves. So yeah, it's Nepo's in a tough spot here, I think. This will be the measure of how how he responds to this will be really telling, I think. If he can't beat Magnus from here, right, like, I think you can't argue that he will have deserved to win the match, clearly. So it's the onus is really on him. Maybe the other side being that Magnus sort of has, I guess, is the expectations of Nepo are sort of lowered now, so maybe he can play with a slightly freer hand.
Yeah, it's an interesting game to lose in many respects, isn't it? Because I guess if you just get like gently crushed by Magnus in a short game, you just kind of move on and say, oh well. But when you're, like you say, when it's an 8-hour game, you almost feel as though you're contributing to your own downfall in that sense, because you're sort of involving yourself in this massive mental and physical push, which is going to take you a couple of days to get over anyway, which means that you're necessarily going to impact your next game with white, as we saw. So you'll go for a really quiet opening in the white, and then presumably that you're going to go next into a game with the black pieces, and you're going to have to hold on for another draw in that piece. And so it just feels as though you're sort of getting onto this downward momentum. And I guess the difficulty for him is going to being able to see whether he can pull himself out of that like slow downward trend, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, chess is a zero-sum game, right? And so you can play, if you lose a game in 10 moves or lose a game in 130 moves, right? It's the same. It's the same sort of its impact on the score, on the overall score, right, of the championship is the same. And so to have invested so much time and effort in that game and then still come out with a loss, that's, hard to take, right? I guess if he had, he's feel like he must have sacrificed so much of his energy for that game. Also, so many opportunities, right? Because there were, he had chances in that game, and so it must that must be sort of pretty tough. But I guess you can. That's what perhaps separates champions in so many sort of sports and endeavors from those who sort of from those who aspire to be champions, right? Is that you can never, the true greats, right? Like, you can never, I guess, count them out, and they find the will to overcome. and that's what Magnus has done time and again from tough situations. And and it will, if Nepo can do it, then he'll deserve it, and if he can't, then well, it's probably the right result.
Yeah, just to get back on the chat for a little bit before we close. Good to see Torjura in the chat again. Saying, I reckon Magnus is going to go for 1d4 again. Nepo's Petrov is really strong, although Nepo might be tempted to try at the Sicilian after the loss, as you said, as well. Duncan saying hello all, and he said I'd like to see 1c4 tomorrow, but I suspect 1d4 is more likely. So yeah, it seems as though people are expecting more of the sort of Catalan / pseudo Catalan stuff again tomorrow.
Yeah. I think that I know that if you're saying that, suggesting that Magnus is also tired and he's happy to draw out now, that maybe the Petrov is the way to go. But I guess he has sort of there's a more of a variety of stuff that Nepo can go for out of e4. Whereas if Magnus so you can say, okay, he's not getting anything out of the Petrov, but additionally, right, so he's not going to get anything out of the solid if Nepo tries to play solid. And then he potentially is opening himself up to something that's really double-edged, where Nepo's going to get some chances. Whereas if he plays d4, even if Nepo tries to, so in the games where Nepo's tried to keep it quite nice and solid, right, in like the first example where we had the sort of like mainline Catalan stuff, that was more testing for Nepo. And if Nepo tries to sharpen it up, it'll be the same sort of thing. And the Grunfeld is sort of a lot, I guess, more forcing than the Sicilian as well, right? Like it's very hard to prepare as white in the Grunfeld because there are so many lines that you can play, at move 4, and so it's sort of it gives Magnus sort of more control. I think just however Nepo chooses to play, I think Magnus is better off with d4. I think that's probably just the evidence we've seen, is that d4 has got him more than e4. So c4 would be interesting to play, but it's I guess less testing. But again, if Magnus is happy for a draw, perhaps that's a bit quieter.
And it will all become very clear tomorrow at 12:30 when the next game kicks off, game 8, and we will be back again tomorrow evening at some point, depending on whether or not we get an epic as we did in game 6, or a less epic as we did in game 7. But thank you to everyone in the chat who's been in touch. It's great to have you on board with us. If you want to listen back to this as a podcast, it will be going out on our channel, so you can find it there. And yeah, other than that, I don't think there's anything for me to do other than say thank you again, Robin, for chatting, and I'm looking forward to chatting again tomorrow.
Cheers. Yeah, see everyone tomorrow.